Hey, this is H1, and we're going to be running it back with another episode talking about chess knowledge, chess moves, and chess understanding. Today, we're going to be talking about pawn structures, the secrets of pawn structures, what every chess player should know. And this is primarily for you beginners that don't know strategy, and this is the beginning of your journey on knowing what to do when there's no tactics around, okay? Not every chess game is a puzzle. There's not going to be a checkmate in two. Sometimes you need to just accrue those little advantages in the position, and then maybe, just maybe, there's like a winning tactic at the end. Let's get started. So let me put this chessboard up here right quick, and yeah, here we go. Move like slightly to the right. I guess it's to the left to you, but you know, who's debating about that? Let's get started. We got this normal chess game. This how a normal chess game works out. And then we have this position. The first thing that we're going to be learning about is double pawns. What is double pawns? Well, double pawns is basically two sets of pawns on the same file. Sometimes it could be three sets of pawns, but if you have three sets of pawns on the same file, that's really bad. Now, one thing that you need to know is that sometimes it's not always a bad thing to have double pawns, especially if you have these rooks on these open lines. Depending on the position, tactics always overrule. But generally speaking, these are very weak. And not only are these double pawns, these are isolated double pawns, which is worse than anything else. All you got to do is slap like a knight right there, and you're stopping two pawns. And then another thing too that I just want to explain is that if you have double pawns, this is basically 1 point. Don't even count this as 2 points. You got 1 point. You're down a pawn if you got double pawns and your opponent has regular ones. Let's continue. These are double pawns too, but it's not as worse as isolated double pawns because you're actually controlling a lot of squares with these double pawns since they're all together and they can be protected. With the previous ones, they cannot protect themselves at all. So that it's just a bad idea. But you should be trading pieces so that your opponent has this weakness instead of you having this weakness. And let's say you're trying to do something and then you just get this weakness out of nowhere. Let's say you miss your calculation and now you're strategically bad into position. Get rid of these as fast as possible. And that should be pretty much your goal if you're playing chess. If you have weaknesses, to get rid of them. Sacrifice those pawns for more activity. It has to be something concrete. You can't just be sacrificing pawns all willy-nilly. It has to be a plan behind the sacrifice. Let's go on to the next structure. So, isolated pawns. Isolated pawns are basically pawns, one pawn, that cannot be protected by any other pawn. For example, for white, there are 4 isolated pawns. Black has no isolated pawns since their pawns can pretty much be protected with one move. They are bad, generally speaking, especially if they are not passed pawns. But we're going to talk about passed pawns pretty soon. Do not get isolated pawns. Next thing that you need to know, if you're a beginner, you need to know what pawn chains are. You've probably seen these in your games, and generally speaking, if you're in a closed position, then you're going to see these a lot more. Pawn chains. Pawn chains are basically chains of pawns that are protecting one another with one base, 1 point. And just to give y'all like a little principle, when you're playing chess, let's say you're the black pieces here, you should be going after this base here, because once you go after the base, then all the other pawns pretty much break away. They dissipate. But as you face off against tougher opponents, they're not just gonna sit there and let you go after the base. And if your opponent has a pawn chain too, you should be going after their base. One principle that I'm just going to share right now is that if you have a pawn chain going a certain direction, just like how this pawn chain is going to the king side, that's the direction that you should be attacking in. So, I'll go more in detail in like my next video. Actually, put that in the comments down below if you want to see how we can attack with the pawn chain. Let's continue. Pawn islands. What are pawn islands? Well, pawn islands are basically little islands of pawns on the chessboard, and it's basically a space or a file in between all these islands here. These pawns cannot protect each other. Now, you probably already guessed, but the more pawn islands you have in the position, the worser off you are because they can't protect one another. So if they are attacked, then you have to have a full piece protect that pawn. And if you have a rook or a queen protecting a pawn, that queen is not doing its best job that it should be doing. It should be doing something more important than protecting a pawn that is 1 point. Now for the black pieces, this is what we should be trying to go after. Just 2 pawn islands. 2 pawn islands is enough. Generally, in every single game, you're gonna at least have 2 to 3 pawn islands. But having 4 is pretty much insane, especially if you are going into the end game. Next formation, we have backward pawns. What is a backward pawn? Well, that pawn on e3 is a backward pawn because it cannot go forward at all because this pawn on d5 can capture on e4. So this pawn is going to stay a weakness. A lot of things can happen, especially if you have a backwards pawn, and this is a weakness. For example, if the black pieces, if they had a knight on e4, then that is definitely declaring that pawn to be super weak. Or black can put maybe like a battery, right, on that file to attack that pawn, and yeah, you can just target this pawn pretty much throughout the whole game, win that extra pawn, and then eventually win the whole game. There are multiple chess games of grandmasters actually. That's the whole entire plan, is just to attack that backward pawn for the entirety of the game. Now we're gonna get a little bit more advanced, and we are going to be talking about hanging pawns. What are hanging pawns? Well, hanging pawns are basically these pawns up here on the 4th rank, and it could be vice versa, but these pawns up here cannot be protected by an E pawn or a B pawn. It cannot be protected at all. And you might be saying, well, can't this pawn move up to c5 at this present moment? Well, the thing about these hanging pawn positions is that you have to be very careful to move those pawns because pawns cannot go backwards. And so after you move c5 here, then this d5 spot is a weakness that your opponent can exploit. So your opponent is going to be attacking your hanging pawns while you're trying to get some activity, trying to figure out how to push those hanging pawns to get a winning advantage, or trade those hanging pawns for more of your opponent's healthy pawns. And that is the goal. Man, just take a shot of how many times I say the word pawns. Now, let's move on to protected pass pawns. And these are pawn structures that you should be going for, especially in the end game. A protected pass pawn is a pawn that is protected and has no other pawns to stop it from reaching the promotion square. So this e5 pawn can generally speaking can promote. And the king, well, there are certain positions where the king has to stay in the vicinity of that pawn, or that pawn is just going to promote itself. Protected pass pawns is a common winning strategy, and if your opponent or you yourself have a protected pass pawn, then that's the player that has the advantage in that game. Now, next, pass pawns. Pass pawns generally in the middle game is weak, but in the end game they can be really tough, especially an outside pass pawn. No other pawns can stop that pawn, and then plus, I mean, dude, this pass pawn on the edge can be a distraction for your opponent. So you could be pushing up this pawn, your opponent's king could be like running over here, right, trying to stop that pawn, but then you're like, okay, well, since my opponent's king is running over here to stop this pawn, then we can just run over here with our king to capture all these pawns on the king side. And so that's just one way how you can use a outside pass pawn to win in certain chess games. And I know I'm gonna need examples. If you want to see more videos on like clear grandmaster examples, just let me know in the comments and I can create that for you. Last pawn structure that we're going to be talking about, which is one of the best ones, is the connected pass pawns. Connected pass pawns is basically 2 pawns that are connected that can protect each other. It's kind of like hanging pawns, but they can actually move forward, and they can promote themselves, and they can protect each other while promoting themselves. So there is a principle: if there are 2 connected pass pawns on the 6th rank, then they're more powerful than a rook. If they're on the 7th rank, then they're more powerful than a queen. I would just keep that in mind in case you want to do some pretty cool sacrifices to like figure out why that is. All right, but there's been a lot of games where grandmasters sacrifice their piece for connected pass pawns because they are so powerful to use, especially in the end game. They're pretty much unstoppable to stop. Yeah, and so even if there was like a king on a6, this king could never take the a5 pawn because the other pawn can just move forward to promote itself. And that's pretty much all there is to the pawn structures that I wanted to show you at this present moment now. Hopefully you learned something new, and hey, give me some ideas on some other pawn structures or other videos that you want me to do in the comments down below. All right, keep on fighting to the end, staying focused in chess and in real life too. I'll talk to you later. Peace.